I'm from Erie, right? Just a short ways, about a mile from here. Was in the Air Force for 4 years active and 4 years inactive. Started racing cars in the Air Force. I'd raced before that, and then I got a chance when I got stationed in Niagara Falls to race at Buffalo Civic Stadium, and I still have the posters from that. My dad died young. He was a steeplejack, drove bus, raced motorcycles, as I did, and my son. He raced down off East Lake Road. Used to be what they called the old fairgrounds, and it's off Iroquois Avenue in Lawrence Park, and it was called the Expo, and he raced flat track there, and that would probably been in the 30s and 40s. Yeah, I won the East Coast Invitational Championship in 1960. I have the last flag that I won the feature from Coon Road Speedway. And I would donate it to that because it's just sitting in my cabin down there.
Wow. And
it's handmade, and it was from September 11th, 1960. They raced one race after that at the New Year, and they didn't have enough crowd to even make the pay, and they didn't have enough to pay me the day I won the feature. They give me a little bit, and I said, I'm going to take the flag. I'll put it in my trophy case. So the next year they tried to open, the firemen at Hatfield run that racetrack. And Hatfield just is too far out, and people weren't traveling. On Sundays in the early days, we was getting a pretty good crowd. And there's like Kenny C. and Tom Dill and Jimmy Dunn and myself all brought a lot of people in. But then we started moving into the late models and things, and that was kind of the end of that history. My brother took me to Jennings Goat Farm. My brother was older, and Jennings Goat Farm had an open-wheel dirt track. It sets out.
By the way, where is that?
It was located off near Old Waterford Road, up behind where the Prescal Casino is, where that big hill mountain where the garbage dump is. On top of that hill was Jennings Goat Farm, and there's a racetrack. And Tom Mountain had a race car, and it was driven by Art Robbins, and it was open wheel roadster racing, and that was the first. I come home so excited I was throwing up and I couldn't sleep. I loved it so much. I don't know if you can understand that much emotion and passion for a sport, but that was me. Yeah. From a little kid, it's all I ever can remember. My brother had a wrecking yard, and I started driving a car at 7 years old. And I sat on a Pepsi-Cola case, an old wooden case, and they had blocks on pedals, and I'd take it down through the field. And then a friend of mine, their family, the name was Keel, and they had a farm in South Ripley. And in South Ripley, they had a big, later had built a race car for Sulphur Springs, but I was at probably 10 or 11 years old. I'd take that old Chevy down through the field and slide it sideways and just get all excited over it.
Is this Don Keel?
That was, he built the car. His dad, Bill Keel, owned the farm, and then the boys inherited it. His brother was Bunky, Bill Keel, but they had built the number 96 car that Dick Haig had driven at Sulphur Springs. Merle Swift that had the 69, and they had the 96. Ernie Stetson started Sulphur Springs Speedway, and I knew Ernie quite well.
How long did you race at Sulphur Springs?
A couple of years.
Years. What's your recollections of that track?
Oh, put on your boxing gloves when you're ready to leave. It was rough. You had the boys, the good old country boys, come out, and the city boys, and everybody flexing their muscles, and you bump somebody, they would be upset. But it was another downhill, uphill track. It wasn't real level. I had a bad wreck down in Mercer, and I was still in the service, and I was stationed in Niagara Falls, and I was racing up there, and then I lost my ride because the guy couldn't afford to keep the car up. And so when I come home on weekends, I met a fellow by the name of Cloyd Van Sites. And Cloyd Van Sites I had a 39 Ford Coupe, and he put roll bars in it, and I took it to Mercer and started racing there for a year there. And another track that you may not be aware of was Pulaski Speedway. That was near West Middlesex, near Sharon. It was a half-mile dirt, and we'd run close to 100 miles an hour back then with those flatheads. Well, they was kind of not stock. And it was a very fast track, and it was running overheads at the time. Now, I still run in a flathead because I love those old flatheads, and I run against the overheads. And there was Ronnie Crash and Ted Wise and a lot of big names that come out of the Pittsburgh, Blackie Watts, and some of these fellows that raced there. I did not win races. The best I ever had on that track with the flathead was a 4th place, I think. But it was the first 4th place I'd ever had.
Yeah. Did you get a rush at the time? Or did it satisfy your needs?
Oh, I'd come out of the second term laughing. It was such a rush to me. It was such a feeling. Even with bad handling cars, it was such a rush.
There were some rules, but not a lot of them those days. But what was the kind of go-to change to the car, the chassis, whatever it happened to be, that you would look to?
Well, the setup is going from armor shocks to tube shocks, and change the handling of the car, which of course increased your speed and over time. In the early days, you had to qualify for the race. You didn't just get in and race. They run time trials, and then you had to qualify in the first 4 of the heat races to be eligible for the feature. And then they had a consolation race for the people that didn't make it, and the first 4 of that they put together, and that's where you had your feature lineup.
So you're from Erie. What was the draw to a place like Coon Road? It's up in Westfield, but do you remember kind of somebody saying, "Hey, Dave, let's go"?
Yes, they did. It was a Sunday race, and I had a dragster motorcycle that I used to drag on Saturday, and then if I dated my wife that night, I knew I'd win on Sunday up at Kuhl Road. I was superstitious. She can tell you that's a true story. Before we was married, we've been married 56, 57 years. Got married in 1960, so it's 57 years we've been married. Of course, when we first started dating, she was rooting for Tom Dill.
Well, wasn't every lady rooting for Tom Dill?
Well, I known Tom from the time I was probably 11 years old, 12 years old. At about 15, I had a Harley 74 that I only weighed a little less than 100 pounds. I was just and I couldn't start it. I'd have to run it down the street, jump on it, kick it in gear, and start it. And Tom would come around with his bike, and Tom was kind of a quiet guy, and he'd come over and he'd start it for me, and away I'd go. No driver's license, no license plates. I just had to have that speed. I enjoyed it. Come out of the pits on the east side of the track, and the track ran north and south. And it was a large 3rd mile, maybe close to a half. It had long straightaways. And there are pictures on the internet of that track from the air. And when you come out of turn 4, it was kind of an uphill grade. So you was going uphill, and then when you come around, you go like the Dickens downhill. It was a nice track.
Did you have to affect your driving abilities? Because that's not normal going downhill.
It was so, you didn't feel it because you was going at a speed that everything looks pretty level.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful, wonderful track to race on. It was wide and it was big. And the guys that run it, the firemen, all volunteers, just were nice guys. You come out of the pits on the east side of the track, and the track ran north and south. And it was a large 3rd mile, maybe close to a half. It had long straightaways. And there are pictures on the internet of that track from the air. And when you come out of turn 4, it was kind of an uphill grade. So you was going uphill, and then when you come around, you go like the Dickens downhill. It was a nice track.
Did you have to affect your driving abilities? Because that's not normal going downhill.
It was so, you didn't feel it because you was going at a speed that everything looks pretty level.
Yeah.
It was just so, it was a wonderful, wonderful track to race on. It was wide, it was big. And the guys that run it, the firemen, all volunteers, just were nice guys.
Coon Road, it would have been number
222.
222. And why that number?
Well, the number I raced in the stadium, I drove a car that belonged to the Klinger brothers, and that was their number. It started at Sulphur Springs. They needed a driver, and I was there just watching. Somebody said I could drive a car, and I got into the car, and they kept me for 2 or 3 years.
Okay. So 222 was the number at Coon Road, and you had some successes there.
Yeah, I guess I did. I won a few.
Yeah.
I also run a car number 14 at Coon Road. That was in the early days when they first started running. And then I built this, I was off about a month, or I would have finished further up in the points than I did. I was, in that, it says I was 6th in the book there. But I had a whole month off where I built this new car, this white 222 I built, with Jim Dunn's help. And I remember Jim Dunn won the championship at Coon Road. And there was, the 4 of us was running up front. There was Jim, Kenny C., Tom Dill, and myself. And I was running in 4th place. And they were just banging and slapping, and I'm switching lanes back and forth. And I said, I'm going to back off because they're going to get tangled up. 1 lap to go, and Jim needed it to win the championship, to clinch it, and so did Ken. They was just a few points apart. And then they tangled up in the 4th turn, and I went around and won the feature. Well, Jim broke loose, and I made the lap after I won, come around, pushed him across, and give him enough points.
What else can you tell us about that particular race?
Well, it was, I mean, we were all rubbing fenders. It wasn't a normal race. It was, we were either going to destroy our cars or win. Kenny C. was always a gentleman. He probably don't remember me. It's been a lot of years, but I remember we went to Daytona one year, and we were out on the boardwalk, and they had, this souvenir store had games and stuff in it out on the boardwalk. And my wife and I are one end of it, and I turn around and look, and there's Kenny C. Yeah. And so we spent that day together, and we went to a midget race in Daytona that night together, Kenny C. and I, and our wives. But to go back to the Coon Road race, that day, only history I think I won a heat race, and maybe Jim Dunn, but everybody was running hard. There was like 2 separate packs. We was running 1 pack, and then there was a pack quite a ways back, and it was just, it was so much fun.
Back to Coon Road, what kind of money were you racing for out there in 1960? I mean, you won some races. You must have.
I think it was.
You knew what the pay envelope looked like.
I think it was the biggest I think I ever got out of there was like $75 for a feature, and most of the time it was $50. And it was not very much for maybe a $10 for winning a heat race. It wasn't a lot of money.
What kind of money did you have in your car at that time? Would you estimate?
In the early days, probably $300, $400. And then when we got to build a good flathead engine, you'd have $500 or $600 just in an engine to bore and stroke it in a cam and do all the things you had to do to be competitive. And to this day, I love flathead engines. I just really think they're the greatest.
Hey, could you get a sense in 1960 that because of the crowds and stuff, it was maybe financially being struggling?
Oh yeah, because the crowds in the stands were, you almost knew everyone. Oh, another name that run there was Bob Doverspike, I can remember that. And another name was Bob Tobin. Mm-hmm. And then the whole Hauser clan run there. They had a lot of brothers and cousins. I mean, there was a lot of them. And
but the crowd was diminishing, you could just see that?
Yes.
What did you attribute that to? Why was the reduction in the crowds?
Well, I really would think that if there was any reason to go back and revisit that is because probably the location, the advertising, there wasn't a budget that people in Erie wasn't aware of it, and the late model track wasn't open yet in Erie, and we didn't have we had the Thunderbolt and Harbor Creek Raceways, and then they were not lasting very long.
So 1960 and then the early 61, that was sort of the end of your, I use the term spectator jalopy car. And
We voted to, in the engines, if you couldn't see it, it was legal.
Really?
Well, everybody was cheating a little bit here, a little bit there, and they'd tear down. I should have had zippers on my heads because we had to tear down the engines and measure the bore and stroke, and of course there's always ways that every engineering minds, you know, we get around some of the racing flatheads.
Where did you get your mechanical ability from?
My brother always had old cars, and we worked on them out on the farm, my uncle's farm out, and we did. When I was a kid, you didn't buy your race car, you build it. And you just learned, every kid that I knew could take a rear end or an engine apart and put it together, and we just for drag racing in the city, I used to change gear ratios just so I could go red light to red light. Well, I went into the service in '53, and in that meantime, the sportsman field closed down, and racing is basically dead in Erie. While I was in the service, I had a chance. I was in the military, but I was still had a regular hours to work, and I worked in a gas station. A guy there had a stock car, and I talked him into letting me drive it, and I drove it in Civic Stadium. Of course, in the service, you weren't allowed to do that, so I raced under the name of Joe Koppel. That was the guy that owned the car. Koeppel. I can give you all the names of the people that run there. And there was Dick Hurd, Dutch Hogue, Bobby Sun. Them are all New York guys. Dutch Hogue was the big one. The Nolan Swift that raced the 10-pin, and he was out of Spencer, New York, someplace. Flip Johnson. The flagman was Dick Zimmerman, got burned in a bad fire. We had a restart one night, and somebody stalled up front, and they're coming up with the flag wide open, and there was a big explosion and burnt a lot of people. It was a bad one. I think a guy by the name of Campbell got hurt pretty bad in that fire. That was at Civic Stadium.
what was your car number?
93.
93.
There should be a picture in there. It'll be a pink and white car. There might be a picture in there of it someplace.
Okay.
If not, I'll look it up. There was with a girl standing in front of it. Come home, and Van says, well, I had this car I was building for a street rod, and somehow I decided to make a stock car of it because I really love stock cars. So I would come home, he'd get the car ready, and he had a car he raced, and we'd race at Mercer on Saturday night, come back and work all night if we had any night left, to get the car ready this Sunday to go back down and race at Pulaski, Pennsylvania. Then I'd drop the car off and drive like a maniac to get back to base before roll call in Niagara Falls. And I did that one whole summer till I was badly injured in Mercer. I had come out of a turn and the seat belt had come open. And I didn't have an arm or anything to keep me in the seat. And when I slid out of the seat, I went down on the floor, and part of me laying on the accelerator. And I was going down track, and a guy T-boned me, brought the frame over far enough to break the bottom out of the transmission. And I was pretty well stoved up. They had to hurry to get me back to Niagara Falls because it wasn't good to get hurt while you was in the service, especially self-inflicted by automobiles. And they built me another car, and I raced that for a while, and I blew the engine. Actually, I didn't blow the engine. They had built me a car, and I run it once, and the car was in too heavy of a body to race down there. And they started racing at Sulphur Springs, New York. And Merle Swift wanted to borrow my racing engine to race stock, and he blew it up. It blew. Then the cleaners saw me and said, hey, I got a car, how about driving? Oh, of course. So I got in the car and I drove for them. There's be several pictures. The red and white pictures in there of the 222 would be the Klinger's car. The white car was the car that I built mid-season that won so many races with.
From Mercer and Pulaski to your next
Sulphur
part of your
Springs.
racing career.
Started at Sulphur Springs for just a little bit of that year and a little bit of the next, and I had to reset up the Klinger car and we monkeyed with it for quite a while. We'd win some heat races. We didn't win anything really big in it. Then pretty soon these other tracks opened up, and again Kuhl Road open, and I had the benefit of racing the first race that's ever run at Kuhl Road.
You're saying Kuhl, aren't
Yeah.
you? Kuhl.
Yes, which is up here off 430. And
what was your number there?
222.
Okay.
And so I raced there, and I think the one night I won the heat, the semi, and the feature, and that was a highlight of my career there. And then one of the last races in the stadium, I'd won that. That was a 50 lapper, but I won that with the red and white 222. And then I left racing at the driving the Klingers. I went to Florida and raced. You can see there's some Florida clippings there where I was racing in Florida. And I was down there for a part of a year, starving to death. I was trying to race with the big boys.
Yeah.
And that was, oh man. I was racing with Pancho Alvarez, Judd Larson. These are Indy drivers.
Yeah.
Pete Foltz.
So you were racing sprint cars?
I just had a few rides in the sprint. I raced mostly modifieds. I raced at Phillips Field,
Which was where?
Tampa.
Okay. Up to Kuhl Road.
Yeah.
Who was up there racing against you at the time?
Tom Dale raced a car number 3860. It belonged to Russ Cross on P Street. He had a garage and a auction he used to hold, and Tom, I think, worked for him. And there was Porky Chambers, Bob Tobin, myself. I think the Gilberts would come in there. John Whitehead would come there.
How about Joe Mobilia and his cars?
Well, strange. Joe Mobilia, in the very early days before Tom had drove for him, or Richie Bunnell, or any of them, I had a little car lot in the 1800 block on Buffalo Road. And he had a car, he put together a 40 Ford Coupe, and a guy by the name of Bus Anderson drove that car. And number 72. And then he asked me to drive for him one time, and I said, no, I'll stay. I was driving for the Klingers at the time. But then they started driving. But Joe Mobilia, where there was a controversy, he'd be in the middle of it. But I was
It's
good.
not the first time we've heard this. I want you to know this.
Well, I knew Joe from 1956 to he passed away, and we had a good friendship between us. When I had the car business, he'd ride down south with me and try and sell some cars down there, or buy cars. He is very excitable, very emotional man. He had a bad arm, and he'd get into a fight with somebody, he'd be swinging that bad arm. It would be almost comical, but he wasn't afraid of anybody. I can tell you another story about Joe Mobilia if you'd like to hear it.
Yeah, we're here.
I hope that, well, this is hilarious. Joe Mobilia, Tom had his own car for a while, and he got it from Burt Middlecroft. He worked there as a mechanic, and he built a Dodge Charger or something up that's pretty fast. And there's a lot of stories. I don't think he ever paid Burt for the car, but I know the car. But anyhow, racing one night, and Joe's going to race. We're in the feature, and Joe's in the feature, and he's back behind me for some reason. And we're running a few laps, and I mean, he's in the way all the time, you know. And all of a sudden, here comes Joe just charging out of nowhere. He's under me, he's over me, he's pushing me. And I'm driving harder and harder into each and every turn. Where did this man get this car? This can't be true. So at the end of the race, I found out that, this is a funny part of it, Joe had pulled in the infield, and Tom ran over and got in the car, and Tom Dill was in the car. We still have, when I seen Tom, I seen him last summer, the summer before, we was at an old car meet, and we laughed about that, because, you know, you look up in the mirror, and there's the guy that you've been laughing, all of a sudden pushing you here, pushing you there. I thought maybe it's only running on 7 cylinders. I bought a car, it was a Grand National car. It belonged to a guy by the name of Augie Sandman, and he was racing in, have you ever heard of Markham? Mark?
Yeah, Mark, M-A-R-C.
Yeah, John Markham owned that. Well, we belonged to that, and I had a chance to, his car was a 58, and by 61 it was too old to run in Mark. So I traded him my motorcycle. I had a white Harley 74, and I traded him for the race car. And then I took that race car, and I started racing at Bust-Eye that year when it opened.
Did you say his name again? Augie
Sandman.
And where was he from?
Clinton, Pennsylvania. He worked for the Pittsburgh airport.
Okay.
But he raced in Markham, as well as did Nelson Stacy. Markham become ARCA. And then a lot of those drivers from ARCA, like Nelson Stacy, moved from there and that. And then I also had driven one time a car that belonged to Harold Reynolds, Ike Reynolds. And then another time, I went to Canfield, Ohio to run the car, and a guy by the name of Mike Claypack needed to keep his points going and the late model division, so he'd come over and ask if I'd submit the ride to him. I said, go ahead. To me, he was the king, you know, he's a NASCAR champ and everything else in modifieds. So I did have a late model experience there. Then that's how I got to know Augie Sandman out of ARCA, and it moved in through a guy by the name of John Reynolds had a little repair shop on Glenwood Park Avenue, and up on Glenwood Park Avenue is where Ike Reynolds built his cars. It was a brother to John, and he also had one of those Chrysler 300s like the Phlox run at Daytona. It was white with a number 300, and on the big tracks it was pretty good. Never drove one of those. I did drive the Pontiac, and it was always geared wrong, and I never did anything with it, but I did have some good rides. And I was able to move into driving that Ford. And I started out, I had to learn the hard way that you can't pass on the inside of those late models because the tails want to come around, and I couldn't get it through my head that you had to run a little wider with it, and you had that on-sprung weight and overhead, and they was just a heavier car that handled a whole lot rougher. But yeah, I remember the first race that I raced on that, and I was in the top 10, but it was not pretty. And I had raced with Samuel Mancuso, Bobby Snars was there, Floyd Finelli was a gentleman. Floyd Finelli was always the nicest guy you ever want to meet. And the racetrack, he was tough, but he was just a nice guy. That 59 Ford in there someplace on a tow bar setting. Well, that was Julian Busing's old ARCA car, and I bought it out of the junk pile and put it together and built the Keep It Racing.
There's Marv Thorpe. Do you have any?
Marv ran a Plymouth, and about a 57 or 58 Plymouth. And Marv, at that time, he had a little gas station down in town, and he run okay. He wasn't a winner or he wasn't a loser. He just run mid like the rest of us did. He run about mid, but it was nice. John Whitehead wasn't running late model at that time, and neither was Kenny C yet.
Bobby Schnars.
Yep. And when he'd passed me, I thought my car quit running. That's how fast that M1 was. It used to irritate me. I just want to take the wheel and go in there because I was running a 312 cubic inch Ford with a cam in it, and I was running against 390 Fords and I don't know how big they bored them Chevys out. Ronnie Blackmore hadn't started running late model yet. That came later, but there was Eddie Kiskell and his partner Hyle Russell. Yeah, they were partners, and they was cleaning up. Dean Layfield was pretty popular, but they were more popular up at the Skyway.
Skyline.
Yeah. Now that was a track, if anybody had ever talked to you about, you were sideways when you come by the flagman. It was almost like a complete circle. If you didn't have a good handling car, you shouldn't be there, because they talk about this drifting in this day and age. That was a drifting, and it was really fun. To move around cars, you was always like you was in a turn moving around somebody. It's a pretty exciting track.
You must have raced against Squirt Johns.
Lots of times, pitted with him many times.
Tell us a good Squirt John story.
Squirt kept to himself pretty much, kind of quiet. He was not a show-off. He wasn't looking for anything. He'd just get in the car. But when he got in those Dodges of his, he would fly. And Squirt Johns, I can remember he and Dick Litz got into it in Erie one time. And Dick Litz jumped up on the hood of Squirt's car. Now these are two pretty good sized guys. And Dick's trying to kick the windshield out of the car. I don't know what happened, but I remember that pretty clearly. As a matter of fact, I drove Dick Litz's car after I was done with my late model. He had a number 29. He drove for a guy by the name of Nelson Ball. And Dick Litz went to either driving his own car or somebody, because the car wouldn't handle, and I had the attitude I could make it handle. I was wrong. It was terrible. You come down a straightaway, and it had a 390 with a cam, and it was pretty fast. And just the screaming, and all of a sudden it just take off on you.
Wow.
We changed steering columns, we changed suspension, and Dick got where he wouldn't drive it. I said, I can drive it. But if you don't have that attitude, you just never get into a race car. You just got to feel that you can win no matter what. I tried to always run as clean as I could, but I remember driving several different late models of people, they need to fill in because somebody was sick or off. But the worst late model I ever drove, I had two of my own, and I drove one of somebody else's. Was that 29 car that belonged to Nelson Ball. It was just a scary. Not only was it fast, it was just, you didn't know where it was going.
In 1961, the Eriez Speedway opened.
Yes.
In July of 61.
Look in there and you'll see that I'm listed as one of the first drivers to race there.
And you were there on opening night.
I sure was.
Tell us about opening night of Eriez Speedway.
All I can remember is Tom Dill was driving that white Ford for Julian Busink, and he had I think they had a 390 engine in it. I'm trying to stay ahead of him with my 312. It wasn't an easy job, especially with Tom as good as he was. Tom had there's only one other driver that I think was to the task, was Jimmy Dunn. Was a fantastic. He could drive anything. He was just a great man. There's a lot of good drivers. Bobby Snars was a great driver, but I think overall talent, somebody could get in and drive anything. It could be Tom Dill. He could drive anything. And all I know that if you're racing for a position, you didn't want to be near him because you're going to get taken out or you're going to run over the top of you. I like Stateline Speedway because it was a driver's track. It was so flat. And it was full of cinders. And in the early days, we didn't have locked rear ends. We didn't run there with locked rear ends. And which made the cars handle a little. You had to set up the suspension entirely different to get enough weight for both tires to turn. And I remember Sammy had built some strange cars. I think he built a Studebaker or something like that. But then I remember he and a guy by the name of Kenny Johnson both had Holman and Moody Fords. They were like, one was blue and the other was yellow. And then there was a guy by the name of Bob Dole that raced there. And these guys had these big cars. They're running tires like this, and I'm running to the junkyard buying tires like this. And 915s, if you can remember the number, that was what I run on the back. I didn't have any. I spread them out on big wheels, but these guys were running racing tires, and it was highly competitive. But those cars, all I could do is drool at them. I mean, even the roll bars were finished down into the welds, everything was just beautiful cars. The only thing I can remember is the one night I'm running as hard as I can, and Tom is right behind me, and I break an axle, and the axle and the wheel went up over it went high enough in the air, as high as the lamppost was there. Everybody remarked on that. That's the only thing I can remember. But those guys, it was real racing. And I would put the class of racer in the 61, 62, 63 in any racetrack in the world, and they'd be competitive. They was that good of drivers.
Recollections of the owners of the racetrack, Len Briggs, Jerry Frank, Don Frank, Lloyd Williams.
They, gentlemen, but I remember they would be the nervous type, and they was willing to guarantee your loan if you blew up an engine, because they didn't have many cars in the early days. And they would guarantee the loan if you had to.
Wow.
Now, I never had to use them, but they told me I was out of money and I blew an engine. I found a sponsor, and the sponsor bought me a 427 Ford 4-bolt main with a cam. And I took it out to Eriez and was breaking it in, and I got a lot of, maybe an hour or two. It was so fast. And I remember in the race, in a heat race, I blew the engine. First time out with it. What am I going to do for money? This guy doesn't have any more money to buy me an engine. Back then, that engine with the cam and everything is around $1,000, which is a lot of money. No, well, that's the end of my career, that's all. So Roger Sanford worked for Harris Ford on 12th Street, and he called the factory, and he said, have them bring that race car in and allow us to look at the engine. Well, they got in, they sent their engineers down from Detroit, and they looked at that engine while it blew, and they found that they had what they call a high pressure oil pump, and they went from that to a high volume oil pump that was developed because I blew that engine.
Really?
Yeah, that was documented, and Roger Sanford, who is no longer with us, but he was the parts manager there that called the people in and got that done. So that was one of the credits to racing, that I was able to offer an improvement. So my oil pressure went from like 60 or 65 pounds on straightaway down to about 40. And the engines were staying together then. They were spraying so hard and so thin that it wasn't lubricating anything. It was just crystallizing in there. Dick Linder, to my knowledge, never won a feature. He ran good, he was competitive, he was a nice person. Redhead. V2 was on his car as the famous Dick Linder was. And he was a nice guy, really nice guy. I don't remember him when he run, let's say he run top 5, top 10 frequently. Don Elbaum was a promoter. And Don Elbaum and Joe Sharkey got heads together. Joe Sharkey went to Don Elbaum because he had all the secure Erie Stadium. Don Elbaum, you never seen him around there. Joe Sharkey kind of set up everything that was gone. Joe raced a little bit, but not a whole lot. He ran a garage on 18th Street at the time. And Don Elbaum just secured the stadium, maybe the financing to get things going. They had to haul dirt in to the track to race on.
Was he involved in boxing?
He was a promoter of boxing, yes. I can remember the radio was a big supporter of the stadium. The radio stations would interview you after you won a race, and it was just like you was at the Daytona 500. And to us as amateur racers, it was.
You mentioned briefly Harbor Creek Raceway. Tell us about that place.
That was owned by Dick Zacks. And Dick Zacks took some grapes out on Highmire Road and made a racetrack there. Didn't run very long, but the same guys that run the stadium, the same ones that run at Sulphur Springs, were the guys that run there. And I did win, as a matter of fact, I can show you the trophy that I won there, down there, one of the last races they had. But it was, what I remember, I wrote on to the Harbor Creek, asked me some questions about that, their historical society.
You do it again?
Oh, in a minute. I do it right now. When I climbed into the race car 5 or 6 years ago, I better not go there because it's a brag, but I had tears coming down my eyes when I went into the first turn. I was crying. It just felt so good. And of course I had to win. I always had that, and I did.
This is great.
It was a heat race. It wasn't anything special, but my wife said, They thought they was just going to show cars and put old timers night, and all of a sudden the flag dropped and I was gone.
You ever race against the other Dave Turner?
I didn't. The year that I retired, he come into racing.
Okay.
I know him because we both fly. I was a commercial pilot,
I see.
and he flew. And then the guy I sold my airplane to and was one of my close friends I was best man for, it was a retired state cop, Jim Sheelatz, worked for him for a while, so we was drawn together that way, but we was never close friends or anything. I just knew of him. He had number 68 and I had number 58. And many times I have to answer with an answer that, no, I didn't win that race.
Well, maybe he has to say that too, Dave.
Yeah, well, when it comes to the modifieds, I did pretty good there, but it was just so much fun. Some people go to bed counting sheep. I count laps. I just loved it.
We were just talking, we've been dealing with the town historian up in Westfield. She's going to go nuts when she sees this flag.
That's my debut to late model. They talks about my rookie year there, the first. Oh my goodness.
Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you for mentioning it.
I did.
Wow, isn't that, of all the gin joints in all the world? Who would have guessed?
Who would have known?